Okay, uh, welcome back, everybody. This is AP review number 2, I think, for AP Bio. And what we're going to talk about today is ATP, photosynthesis, and cellular respiration. So I've got the same setup here. We'll go through ATP first, then we'll do respiration, and then we'll finish up with photosynthesis. And I'm going to try to simplify this as best I can into what you need to know and what you don't need to know. Because I remember in class, a lot of people were real iffy on photosynthesis and respiration. So I'm going to try to boil it down to make as sort of weed out some of the crap that you probably won't need to know for the AP test. But let's get into it. Okay, so first thing you got to know is this is a molecule of ATP. Okay. Now remember that ATP is made up of we have a it's a nucleic acid. Okay, which means that a nucleic acid is made up of 3 things: a sugar, a phosphate, and a base. ATP is the same thing. We have our base right up here at the top. This is our nitrogen base, hence all of the nitrogen. We've got our sugar down here at the bottom, and then we've got not just 1 phosphate, but 3 phosphates, hence the name. Now, you'll notice that there's a bunch of these negative charges, and the reason why that's important is because ATP, sort of the common rule in chemistry is that opposites attract, right? Positives and negatives want to attract to each other, meaning that like charges are wanting to repel. Now, this phosphate, the reason why we care that this is all negative is because those phosphates are wanting to repel. So it's a pretty easy bond to break. And why that's important is because when that bond breaks, when we get a sever right here that breaks off this phosphate group, that results in the release of energy, which is the whole point of ATP is it's an energy molecule. Okay, so the reason why these are all negative is actually functions as why this is a energy molecule, because when that bond breaks, it releases energy, and that bond wants to break very easily because these are all negatives, and negatives want to get away from each other. Okay, so that means ATP is very unstable. Okay, so here we go. Same thing, right? We have our sugar, our nitrogen base. Good Lord. Our sugar down here, and then our 3 groups of phosphates. And when we break off an ATP molecule, when we break it down for energy use, we consume, or we don't consume, but we break off one of these phosphates, turning this from a adenosine triphosphate into adenosine diphosphate. Di means 2. Okay. So with respiration and photosynthesis, it's all about how do animals and plants make ATP and consume energy and make energy. So, like I said, we're going to start with powers of the cell, the mitochondria. Okay. Now, I did this nice little drawing to try to make this go as simple as possible. Okay. So here we've got this is our mitochondria, and there's a lot of stuff going on in this mitochondria. Okay. But just remember that the equation for respiration is we have to have, when you think about respiration, it's breathing. When you breathe in, you need oxygen, okay? And you also need food. You need food to survive, and that food is in the form of glucose, okay? And what we do with that food and that glucose is we turn that into carbon dioxide. We turn that into water, which you can see if you've ever breathed. Is that the word? Breathed? That doesn't sound. If you have exhaled your breath on a glass or a window or something, right? You can see the water vapor start to form. So that's where the water comes from. And then finally, the main event, the reason we're here is this ATP. Okay. So we're taking in 2 things, and we are producing 3 things. Okay. So let's look at this. So remember, we have 3 steps to respiration. We have glycolysis. We have the Krebs cycle, And then we have the electron transport chain. That is not the right letter. Electron transport chain right here. Okay. Now, this is all taking place in our powerhouse of the cell in the mitochondria. And what you'll notice here is this outer membrane is this sort of burgundy dark blue outside skin layer. And then we have our inner membrane, which is this lighter, I don't know, maybe like a beige. Looks like a beige. And then we have this inner membrane space, this all this blue stuff, okay? So in my picture, the outer membrane is this outer shell. The inner membrane is right here. Now, the main thing you need to understand about the inner membrane is not necessarily the name, but you'll notice that it's all folded. Why is it folded? Remember that the reason why it is folded is because when we fold, we can it increases the amount of surface area that we have. Okay, so a good example would be like if I were to print off something for you guys and I only make it one page, let's say a test, and it's 20 pages. If it was just one per page, then that would be 20 pages. But if I make it double-sided, I increase the amount of surface area, and now I can have the same amount of information or the same amount of stuff in less space. What that means for the mitochondria is that because we fold this inner membrane, it means we can fit more stuff on the inner membrane, making our mitochondria more efficient. So by folding it, we allow our mitochondria to be twice as efficient as if we didn't fold it, okay? Now, what stuff are we putting on there? Oh, we'll talk about that in a second, okay? So we'll start at the beginning, all right? We'll go, I'll try to be as basic as possible, okay? So we're going to start with the first step, which is glycolysis. That says glycolysis. I know you can't read it because I can't write it, but it's, trust me, glycolysis, okay? Now, you'll notice that the first of our reactants we use here. Here's our glucose. So that's the food that you consume. Now, in glycolysis, all you got to know is that you're just turning this glucose into pyruvate, okay? That's it. Now, after we've created that pyruvate, it depends where that pyruvate goes is depending on if there's oxygen or if there is no oxygen. If there's oxygen, we go into the mitochondria and then we do the rest of cellular respiration. If there's no oxygen, then we go do what's called anaerobic respiration. Okay, anaerobic respiration is where you produce lactic acid, or if it's a different kind of cell, you go through fermentation and you produce alcohol. Okay, the longer this process goes on, the more lactic acid or the more alcohol that gets created, which is why people who make different kinds of alcohol will leave those and let them sit for years, right? Wine bottles will sit for years because the longer it sits, the more it ferments and the more alcohol gets consumed. Or if it's lactic acid, think about it. When you do a push-up, one push-up is not, well, for some people, one push-up is hard. For me, I would have a heart attack and die. But for like fit people, one push-up is totally fine. But when they get to the 20th push-up, it's a little bit harder because their muscles are producing more lactic acid. When you get to the 50th push-up, it's a little bit harder because now you've done 50 push-ups to produce lactic acid. So the longer your body goes, the more lactic acid gets produced and the harder it becomes, okay? So that's anaerobic respiration, okay? If we have oxygen, okay, so here's our second reactant. Here's our oxygen gas. If we have oxygen, that's going to go in and it's going to go into the Krebs cycle. Now, the main thing that's going to get produced in the Krebs cycle are these two things right here that I have in purple, NADH and FADH. We've also got an NADH up here in glycolysis. Now, remember, NADH and FADH and in photosynthesis, NADPH are what are called electron carriers, okay? Electron carriers are strictly there to ferry electrons, okay? You'll notice that all these have in common, they all have an H, and that H can all be taken away. So these can all be just the same thing, just without the H, NAD, FAD, NADP, okay? So the whole point of all of these molecules is to grab a hydrogen, and then they're gonna transport that hydrogen to our inner membrane space to do the electron transport chain. That's all they do. They grab a hydrogen, they bring it here, they drop it off, they go and get another one. Back and forth all day long, okay? So the whole point of glycolysis and the Krebs cycle is to produce these electron carriers to bring hydrogens to the electron transport chain, okay? Now you'll notice it's kind of faded, but the Krebs cycle is producing carbon dioxide along with our NADH and FADH. So our carbon dioxide, here's where we get our first, I'm going to do that in like, I'll do that in blue. So our carbon dioxide, this is where we get the first of our reactants, is from the Krebs cycle. The carbon dioxide that you breathe out is produced in the Krebs cycle, okay? So we know what we did with the oxygen. The oxygen gets used in the Krebs cycle and then pyruvate. We know where the glucose comes in. We started that in glycolysis. And now we see where the carbon dioxide gets produced, at least the first time, here in the Krebs cycle, okay? So now we go on to the electron transport chain where we have NADH and FADH that are bringing in these hydrogens. Now remember that hydrogen, or I'm going to write this, hydrogen has a proton, okay? And that proton is what we're there for. It also has an electron, okay? So what we're doing is we're using this electron to power our electron transport chain, and we are going to be using the proton to act as our sort of like, I don't know, the way I always think about it is like a watermill, right? When you a watermill is where you have like water flowing over that circular thing, and as the water spins into the circular thing, it makes the whole mill turn. Well, the protons are the water, and these proteins are the water pump, the water mill. Okay, so the first thing that's going to happen is we're going to these are going to dump off these hydrogens. We're going to use the electron of the hydrogen, and we're going to flow it through these proteins. Okay. Now, what's happening is you'll remember this molecule right here with the 3 little dots at the end of it. That is called ATP synthase. Okay, ATP synthase. I'm going to do this in like a light blue. That's not a light blue. Light blue. Yeah. Okay. So ATP synthase looks like this. Okay. Now, what you'll notice about this is that this thing is a tube. Okay. So what these hydrogen protons are going to do is they're just going to flow through the tube. Okay. It's like a channel, and they're just going to go through. It's like a tunnel. And by flowing through this tube, it's going to cause ATP synthase to spin. Okay. So we know ATP synthase spins. And by spinning, it's going to take an ADP molecule right here and turn it into an ATP molecule. So this is how we're going to make our ATP. So here's our ATP. That's where ATP comes from. Oh, I did that. This is kind of blue. Okay. Now, how do we make sure that we have these protons for ATP synthase to pump through to make ATP? Well, these other proteins are called protein pumps. Okay. Now, if you're pumping something, it's using energy. If you're trying to pump water out of a boat, that's going to require energy. If you're trying to shovel water out of your boat, if your boat is sinking, that's using energy. If you're trying to pump something from one place to another, it's consuming energy. So we know these proton pumps are using active transport. Okay. And what they're doing is they're taking these protons that are getting dumped off, and they're pumping them in one direction. In my picture, I have them pumping them to the left. Okay. So we're pumping these protons. Oh, I did it in red the first time. So there's pumping these protons one direction. Like Harry and Liam. They're pumping them in one direction. Or Niles. I never liked Niles. He looks like a kid. It was more of a... But see, then like Liam is like... I don't know. Like Liam kind of looks gross now. They're all bad. They all have bad music. Okay. Anyway. So we're pumping these protons, and once these protons are pumped, then our ATP synthase can take them and grab them and move them the opposite direction. Okay, so essentially we just get one kind of big circle where the proton pumps pump one way, the ATP synthase pumps another way. Okay. Now, if these proton pumps are using active transport, then it makes sense that ATP synthase is using passive transport, okay? Because remember, passive transport is going from a high concentration, which we are creating with these proteins, to a low concentration. So the ATP synthase always wants a higher concentration on the outside and a lower concentration on the inside, because then it can make ATP without using any energy. Okay, these proton pumps are using active transport because they're having to pump from low to high. Okay, so these are the two proteins that are going to be used in the electron transport chain. We have ATP synthase, we have the proton pumps that are just designed to pump these hydrogen molecules, hydrogen atoms, one direction, and then the ATP synthase is grabbing them and using them as a source to go the other direction. I had a video that shows it, but like, I don't know, my videos don't work on my computer at home, which is, it kind of blows. Now, where do the electrons come in? So here we can see, okay, we have these different proton pumps. We're dumping off the hydrogen. The hydrogens are getting pumped so that we've created our high concentration on the inner membrane space. And then our ATP synthase is using them as passive transport to flow the opposite direction to make ATP. Where the electrons come in is these proton pumps. Remember, because we're doing active transport, most of the time, if it's active transport, it has to use energy, right? It has to use ATP. Doesn't that make sense? It doesn't really make sense for these guys to use ATP just to make ATP. Isn't that kind of just spinning your wheels? Well, yeah. So instead of using ATP to power this active transport, instead what we're using is the electron from that hydrogen is our energy source. Okay, so we're not using ATP to power these proton pumps. Instead, we're using the electron as our power source to pump through these protons, and then we're letting them flow back in through ATP synthase to make ATP. So no ATP is consumed in this process. Instead, the power source for these active transport proton pumps is the electron from the hydrogen. So we basically split the hydrogen in two, into the proton and the electron. The electron is used as the power source, and the proton is used as the thing that we're ferrying, the thing that we're moving from one side to the other side, okay? And that's how we make ATP. So we see where our ATP gets made. It's through ATP synthase. Now, last thing is, what about this water? Where does this water come from? Well, we can see here that these proton pumps, once we've gone through and we've had an electron that goes through all these proton pumps, we get to the end. Well, what do we do with that electron? The electron, we take it and we combine it with the oxygen that we use to breathe in, and we pair that with some of these excess hydrogen molecules, and that's how we make water. So the water in your breath is made from these proton pumps. So we can see it up here. I drew it up here. So we take the oxygen that you breathe in, we take those electrons that we were using as our energy, and we use those as sort of like the glue to combine an oxygen and a hydrogen to make our water molecule, okay? And what's important to know about this is that this whole process, right, glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, the electron transport chain, it's sort of like an assembly line. And this step is the end of the assembly line, okay? So let's say there was no oxygen. If your assembly line stops at the end, everything before that in the assembly line also stops, okay? We don't just keep making stuff, because then there would be a buildup and the whole assembly line would break down. So if the last step of the assembly line doesn't work, everything else doesn't work. Meaning that if there's no oxygen, we can't do anything with these electrons that we're pumping through. We'd have no place for them to go. So we would just get a stockpile of electrons. It would just grow, like a mound of electrons would grow, okay? So this is why you need oxygen to run this whole thing, because if there's no oxygen, then there's no place that we can put our electrons once we're done with them. So this oxygen is used to basically take the electrons and get them out of the body now that we're done with them. So we take these electrons, we use them as glue to bind our hydrogen and our oxygen together, and that's how we make our water, which is where our water product comes in, okay? So that's where, so I've got the equation for respiration up here. We said, okay, our oxygen is breathed in. We use that to move our pyruvate in to start the Krebs cycle, and as our electron carrier, our electron exporter. Our glucose is used out here in glycolysis to start the whole thing. Our carbon dioxide is produced in the Krebs cycle. Our water is produced in the electron transport chain. and then our ATP is made through ATP synthase. Okay. And that is cell respiration. Okay. Now I tried to reduce a lot of the minutia and words that you probably don't need to know or probably won't see. That's sort of the important stuff. Okay. Now on this test, I don't think they're going to ask you any specifics on like names or products or like what, like they wouldn't ask you like what is the thing that ferries protons from glycolysis to the electron transport chain, because that is a searchable fact. Okay. Again, and I've said this before, and I'm going to keep saying it in every review video. What they'll probably see if they ask you an ATP question or a respiration question, it'll probably be a graph-based thing, So they might show you a graph of like ATP synthase production over time, and it'll say, at this point in the graph, the ATP. Let me see. Let me see if I can make one. Let me just make an AP question in Paint real fast. Okay, so let's say this is ATP synthase production. Or no, I totally messed that up. Looks like a freaking 5-year-old is writing this. Okay, so let's say this is time. And let's say this is ATP synthase production. Okay. So maybe, I don't know. So let's say, early in the morning, let's say this is 8 a.m. and let's say this is 8 p.m. Please do not follow these directions for making your graph. Although I did label my axes. But the graph is scaled horribly. So don't scale your graph like this. It's in Paint. Okay. Give me a break. So let's say, I don't know, early in the day, we rise up, we're doing good. And then right about nighttime, we trail off. Okay. So they might ask you, here at 5 p.m. So ATP synthase production trailed off at 5 p.m. Let's change the time. Let's make this 8 p.m. and let's say that this is going to be, let's say this is going to be 12. Okay. So what would cause ATP production to slow down at 8 p.m. And get even lower by 12 p.m.? Well, okay, well, think about it. What happens to a person at 8 p.m.? Well, they're probably going to go to sleep. Not you, because you guys don't go to sleep until 5. But, normal individuals go to sleep around 8 to 10 p.m. So we can see around 8 to 10 p.m. is where we see this drop off in ATP production. Well, if people are asleep, what happens when you're asleep? Well, are you probably consuming more oxygen when you're asleep, or are you consuming less? Well, you're probably consuming less oxygen. So if a person is asleep and they're consuming less oxygen, that means that the ATP synthase production is probably going to go down, because if we remember, if our assembly line gets stopped at the end, it makes the whole thing not work. So if we have less oxygen because we're asleep and we're just not breathing in as much, that means this whole thing is going to go a lot slower, which means we're going to be producing less ATP. So the answer to this question would be what would cause the ATP production to slow down at 8 p.m. and then maybe something specific, like what would be the result. So you would say, okay, well, sleeping, people could be asleep, which is why that production would drop off around nighttime. And then the result would be, well, if this thing is lower, that means we're not synthesizing as much ATP. So the ATP production is going to be less. Okay. That's probably how you're going to see a question like this. A graph or some data, they could give you the same thing in a chart, right? It'd just be like a number. So, maybe like, whatever, at like 8 a.m., we produced, I don't know, whatever, 30 ATPs. And then at 12 noon, we produced 100. And then at 3, we produced, I don't know, 90. And then here we go again at 5 or 8, we produced 40, something like that. They could give you a data table, okay? But that's kind of, if they were going to ask you a question on respiration, I'm pretty sure that's how they would ask it. I don't think they would give you something where it's like a picture like this and be like, hey, what is this thing? What's that molecule? Because those are all searchable facts, and they've been pretty insistent that they're not going to give you searchable facts. Okay. All right. Cool. So let's go on to photosynthesis. Photosynthesis. Okay. That is not right setup. There we go. All right. Let's see if I can scoot this one over. And then you go in front. Hey, look at that. Okay. Okay. Now, I remember photosynthesis being kind of difficult for a lot of kids. So again, I'm going to go as simple as possible. All right. Now, these are our reactants for photosynthesis. And what you should know is that the plants are taking in carbon dioxide and they're taking in water. Now, remember, these are opposite of what animals are taking in. Animals are taking in oxygen and they're taking in glucose. Plants are producing glucose and they're producing oxygen. Okay. So the stuff that animals make, plants are consuming, and the stuff that plants make, animals are consuming. Okay. Just keep that in mind. So we've got I'll just keep it up here at the top. So a plant is consuming CO2 and they're consuming water. And what they're producing is glucose and oxygen and water. Okay. And the whole thing that makes this go is they need light. Okay. They need light to make the whole thing. That's really terrible. Like even for me in paint, that's really terrible. Light. G-H-T. There we go. Okay. So that's our equation. Okay. Now, this is kind of, that's a nicer drawing than this crap I drew for you in paint. But the photosynthesis is basically made up of two reactions. We have the light reactions, which are happening in our thylakoids, which are these green stacks, okay? And then we have the Calvin cycle, which is just sort of happening in the membrane of our chloroplast, okay? The chloroplast is the molecule that this is happening with. This is the powerhouse of this. Well, no, it's not. I'm not going to say that. It's not the powerhouse of the cell. Nothing is the powerhouse of the cell. Okay. So this is the chloroplast, all right? Now, in my drawing, this right here, all of, let's do this in like green because, plants are green. You get it right here? Okay, so this is our thylakoid. All of this is our thylakoid, okay? Now, what's happening is we have our light that comes in, and we've got two different proteins on our thylakoid. We have one is a protein pump. Okay. Now remember we said over here that our proton pumps are designed to pump protons. Okay. So we've got our protons, our hydrogens that we are trying to pump into our thylakoid. Okay. Now, where do those hydrogens come from? Well, we said one of the things that plants need is water. Well, here's our water, and we're going to take the hydrogens off of the water and use those as our protons to pump in. So we break that up. We use the hydrogens as our proton pumps. That leaves us this oxygen that we can produce. Let me do that in another color. I'm going to do that in green. So here's our oxygen that we are producing. So the oxygen that you consume, that we breathe, is produced right here. We take this water, we break it up. The oxygen gets put out for us to breathe, and the hydrogens are used to pump. Okay. Now, this circle thing that does that is what is called a photosystem. Okay. So it's using the electrons again to power the pump, and it's pumping these hydrogens. Okay. So we have photosystem 1 and photosystem 2. We weren't really into photosystem 1 and 2. We're just gonna call it right there. Okay. Just know that these are photosystems, and what they're doing is they're cleaving off these hydrogens, they're producing oxygen gas, and they're passing on these protons for the proton pumps. Okay. That's it. Now, we have all these protons, these really crappily drawn pluses right here, and you'll notice, oh man, look, there's some ATP synthase. So we're going to be using these protons to power our ATP synthase to make ATP. Okay. Well, Mr. Ham, I didn't know photosynthesis made ATP. Well, it doesn't really net any ATP. It's not making ATP for the plant. It's just making enough ATP so that we can use it to power our Calvin cycle, our Clavin cycle. So we're just making enough ATP to power this thing. We're not creating a stockpile or an excess enough for plants to have any large amount of energy. Okay. Now, the last thing that we're making is NADPH, which, if you remember from over here, that is an electron carrier. NADP, the sole purpose is to carry electrons from these hydrogens to our Calvin cycle. Okay. So this is all of this stuff right here. These are all what we call the light reactions. So these are all the light reactions. So you can see we're putting in the water, we're putting on our light. Our water is right here. Our light is right here, and that's what we're getting out of it. We're getting out oxygen, and we're also getting out NADPH and ATP. But the NADPH and the ATP are going to be consumed in the Calvin cycle, so we're not really netting anything. Okay, the only thing we're netting is the oxygen. All right. Now, in the Calvin cycle, what happens is we're taking the CO2 that we also need. So we have our carbon dioxide. We've used our water, and we used our carbon dioxide. And what we're going to do with that carbon dioxide is we're basically going to rearrange, because remember, the whole point of this is glucose, is to make glucose. Glucose is C6H12O6. So what do we need to make a molecule of glucose? Well, we obviously need carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So the carbon and oxygen are from the carbon dioxide. The hydrogen is from the NADPH. So we're just rearranging those three atoms together to make glucose. We're going to need electrons to bind them all together. And we're going to need some ATP to make this whole thing work. Okay. So the NADPH and the carbon dioxide come in, and the Calvin cycle is basically, I'm not going to go into it too deep. But essentially the Calvin cycle is going to rearrange those molecules, third time's a charm, into glucose. So we can see here, all right, we have our carbon dioxide coming in, we have our NADPH coming in, and there's a lot of steps to this Calvin cycle that honestly you probably don't need to know. What you do need to know really basically is just that we're taking these molecules and rearranging them to make a glucose. Okay. And so the Calvin cycle is what is producing our glucose. So the glucose that we made, the glucose that we're producing, is produced in the Calvin cycle. And that's pretty much it. That's photosynthesis in a nutshell. Okay. Again, I don't think they're going to ask you anything specific with these questions. I think they're going to give you maybe a graph if they're asking you something like that. Or maybe they'll ask you if here's a graph, put the graph in context using what you know about photosynthesis and respiration or something like that. But yeah, that's pretty much it. So this is the diagram that I gave to you in class over photosynthesis, and it pretty much is just a better drawing that this crap I drew. I just can't draw on this. I don't know why. I guess I probably could, but I don't really want to. I spent all this time making this, it's not nice, making this drawing. So anyway, is there anything else we need to know? I would say this: the thing that kids get consumed, that I feel like kids get confused on most of the time is, number one, you want to know the reactants of products. So of both of these reactions of respiration and photosynthesis, you want to know what is getting consumed and what is being created. And then for AP, you also want to know where that thing is being consumed and where that thing is being created. So you want to know, okay, for example, our carbon dioxide in our photosynthesis is being consumed in the Calvin cycle. Okay, it's being consumed there. So you can't just say, well, carbon dioxide is being used in photosynthesis. What part specifically is using carbon dioxide? That's the Calvin cycle. Our light reactions are where we're producing our oxygen. So the oxygen that plants make is produced in the light reactions by our photosystems. Okay, so know what gets made, know what gets used, and know where those things get made and where those things get used. Okay. For respiration, you should definitely know the difference between anaerobic and aerobic. Remember, that's just oxygen, no oxygen. You should definitely know the point of the electron carriers. What do they do? They're ferrying hydrogens and electrons. You should know what these things are, okay? And then you should know ATP synthase. You should 100% know ATP synthase. That is a specific enzyme that you should know off the top of your head, okay? We know it's an enzyme because it ends in A's. We know it is synthesizing. It's making ATP. And we know it does basically these three things: that it's a tube, it's a channel that spins, it's powered by protons, and it is passive transport, okay? And that enzyme is how we create ATP. You should know the proton pumps are powered by electrons and not ATP. Okay. These things are powered by electrons and not ATP. And then for plants, you should know that plants have both a chloroplast and a mitochondria. So as where animals are just doing respiration, plants are doing photosynthesis. They're turning around and taking the glucose and the ATP and the oxygen that they make and turn around and giving it to their mitochondria so that they can make ATP. Okay. So plants can do both of these things. We can only do respiration, which makes plants self-sufficient and us reliant on plants. We need plants because we cannot produce glucose and oxygen on our own. Plants can do both. Plants can do both things. Okay. We'll cut it off there. That is photosynthesis, respiration, and ATP. Remember, when you go on Canvas, you're going to be doing FRQ number 3. The video numbers and the FRQs are staggered. So this is video number 2. You're going to be doing FRQ number 3. And then next week we'll talk about cells, cell transport, the types of transport, and I think cell communication. Nah, I'm leaving cell communication off for another day. So we're just doing membranes and transport next week. Okay. Otherwise, it was good to see you. I was gonna do a joke, but now I think I'm just gonna wait and have you. If you want to know the joke, you got to tune into the Zoom. Give you a reason. I'm also not probably going to put a password on the Zoom, seeing as how that was kind of a crap show last time. So anyway, other than that, if you have any questions, DM me, send me an email, let me know, and be sure to like and subscribe.